Welcome to the 49th episode of Everyday Eternal. With me tonight, as always, is my co-host, Bob the Banhammer Huang, and our guest from Thraben University, Phil Gallagher. Say hello, guys.
Hello, guys.
Hello, guys.
How's it going, Phil? Are you excited to be on the show tonight?
Yeah, I love Legacy, and talking about Legacy is like the second best thing, with playing Legacy, of course, being the best thing.
Which you are doing on your channel on Twitch right now, aren't you?
Yes.
For our viewers, can you plug your channel?
Yeah, so I'm Death and Taxes for the Win on Twitch, and most of the time I'm playing D&T, although I'm kind of a Thalia and Friends of Thalia channel.
Great. And Bob, what have you been up to lately?
I don't know, losing a lot. Yeah, so I'm in the third season of the Legacy Premier League. I've experimented with a whole bunch of different decks. I'm not sure what deck is like great. I don't know if there's going to be a great deck like Grixis Delver or Miracles used to be, but we'll see.
Okay, this show, as you guys can probably already tell from the title, is dedicated to a very special deck in the Legacy format right now that I've been thinking about a lot lately, especially since I heard a couple of people make comments on it. The first time it happened was when Thompson on the Game podcast that he runs talked about Death and Taxes for the Pro Tour, and he called it maybe the best deck in the format, which is always like a comment that stands out in a wide open format as Legacy. And then later on, Bob in one of his videos also said, as much as it pains me to say, Death and Taxes might just be the best deck in the format. So here we are today. Guys, what do you think about Death and Taxes right now? Did it really live up to what, like, especially Bob, you recently said about it?
So yeah, my take on it is that like I said, there might not be a best deck in Legacy anymore in the same way that Miracles and Grixis Delver were, but there might be like cycles and changes in the metagame where like one deck is the best deck for a week or a month or maybe slightly longer than that, but generally like there are enough sideboard cards and hate that it's not going to be necessarily the best deck forever. So I think Sneak and Show was one of the best decks for the first couple of weeks, and now we've come around to the cycle where I feel like Death and Taxes is really strong and really well positioned against almost every deck in the field.
Do you agree, Phil? You've played a lot of Death and Taxes as of late. Or I guess for quite a while, actually.
For a long time, including in some metagames that I probably shouldn't have.
Oh, we've all been there.
There have been some rough times for D&T players recently. But as far as right now goes, I'm sitting at somewhere between like a 72 and a 73% win percentage against the field, which is extremely good. And I feel like there are very few bad matchups right now, and my data's tending to support that. So if D&T is not the best deck at this particular moment, it is very, very close to being that.
Yeah, that's like, to me, I am always reluctant to call out a deck as the best deck. I rather prefer to call it like one of the strongest decks or whatever. But I guess that's just semantics, because I think we all agree that Death and Taxes right now is really strong. And it's actually quite unusual for people to somewhat agree on a non-blue deck being probably even, okay, I'm gonna commit to it being the best deck in the format right now. So what would you guys say, since the Death Champion ban has actually changed to put this deck on that next level that it hadn't been to before?
Well, okay, so the big thing that changed was Deathrite and Probe were banned, and then, the check pile deck that had tons of Kolaghan's commands, as well as the Grixis Delver deck, which could often just get under the taxing effects with Deathrite Shaman. Like, both of those decks / archetypes have taken a huge hit, and in addition to that, like, the decks that have come in to fill the metagame, like a lot of Chalice of the Void decks, are generally favorable matchups for Death and Taxes. So pretty much, the things that were good against Taxes are gone, and the things that are, not so great against Taxes have risen up, and Taxes has been in a good position to fight them.
To kind of expand on that, Legacy's also slowed down a little bit. Like in the Deathrite Shaman era, there were a lot of times like where your opponent would lead on like Deathrite on the play followed by True Name, and you were just kind of in a situation where it's like, crap, I don't have time to set up. I don't have time to get this vial on 3 to like let my recruiters and Flicker Wisps really take over the game. And now most of the time you have that. Like, even the Delver decks of right now are just slower at killing you. So, like, Nimble Mongoose isn't an early game threat, at least not, like, for real. And similarly, Gurmag Angler and Death Shadow take a few turns to set up. So D&T just has time to get its game plan going in almost all the matchups now.
So you would say that the general tempo of the format aligns much better with the tempo of Death and Taxes these days. So you're fewer times in like a really awkward spot where you have to take bad trades and can maximize the value that the deck inherently has, like between all the triggered abilities and flicker wisps and stuff. It's probably one of the most value oriented playable decks in Legacy right now.
Yeah, most certainly. For anyone who has been watching the Legacy Premier League, when you have those D&T players on and you just watch them like Recruiter of the Guard, Flicker Wisp my Recruiter, get another Flicker Wisp, and that plan just starts taking off, it's disgustingly powerful.
You know what this reminds me of? You guys probably were around back then, around 2008 or 9 in Standards. Okay, this is quite a stretch, but people played Mystical Teachings. And the best thing to find with Mystical Teachings was another Mystical Teachings. And I've actually seen you guys go like Recruit of the Guard for another Recruit of the Guard, Flicker Wisp, get another Recruit of the Guard. Basically, you were playing like the slowest Alluring deck in the world, and you got all those recruiters before you actually started getting value, and getting value again and again and again. And that's really just like the bulldozer that Death and Taxes can sometimes be if you're allowed to do its thing, which like not every deck in the world does. And I think Colorgan's Command has probably been quite problematic, like being a very consistent 2-for-1 against the deck and also taking out Vile. And that card sees like it does still see play, but much less than it used before.
So it used to be that like every league you would play against a Colligan's Command deck on Magic Online. And now that's not true anymore, which is wonderful. The Grixis control decks are still playing it, and that deck is still pretty good. But it's probably tier 2 deck, arguably.
There's a couple of people in the Legacy Premier League who would disagree with that, and also at the Pro Tour, I guess. I would probably agree because I'm not too fond of Grixis Control in the first place, but we had a talk with BBD and Tana and Grace and Anurag before the previous week's LPL, and we also talked about Grixis Control, and those guys, they really kind of liked it, like, even though I'm more of a Mercus guy. But yeah, Bob, did you actually play? No, you played Grixis Control in the IPA this week, right?
No, I played Grixis Delver. I think Grixis Control, like, given how many people played it at the PT, it had a fairly bad showing. And I think in general, it's a playable deck. A lot of people are going to play it. But in terms of win percentage, I would rate it as tier 2 because it struggles to beat the combo decks, and it's also softer to Wasteland than the check pile deck was because you don't have Deathrite Shaman anymore. So I think what Brian did was he added up to 21 lands, and he might even consider playing 22, which I think is something that you just have to do with that kind of deck now because you don't play a mana dork. And you can always side out some lands against combo decks where you don't need the extra mana sources. But I think that deck is really clunky, like has a lot of 3s and 4s. Like Snapcaster is effectively a 3 at least. And it's even trying to hit like 5 mana to flashback the Kolaghan's Command. So it's just like a very mana intensive deck and has no good way of cheating on mana. And the spells it plays are efficient, but they're not, broken like the way Aether Vial or Days are. So I'm not a big fan of that deck either.
Okay, I'm happy we can agree on that. So I guess next time we're going to have somebody on to defend that deck again. If it keeps doing well, it hasn't done as well in the LPL as of late, but I mean, there's still other leagues, I guess. So Phil, that makes me wonder, how is your win rate different against Grixis Control than, for example, against what it used to be against Checkpie?
So looking at what I have here for data, post-banning, I'm currently 3-2 versus Grixis Control. Looking at my pre-banning data, I was 5-1 versus Checkpile, but I want to say that the Checkpile deck was much, much better against D&T than the modern Grixis Control deck is. So my pre-banning data I have there is from a small sample size of about 100 matches. But prior to that, when I was looking at my Checkpile data, I personally was batting close to like 50-50 or slightly above, but the average pilot was having something closer to like a 40% win rate or below with D&T versus Checkpile.
When you face Grixis Control right now, even though like I guess your sample size isn't that great, but you would feel okay. Like, where do you gain the edge in the matchup? Is it like the mana disruption or just your overall value that you have in the deck? Why do you not hate this matchup?
So I don't hate the matchup. Mostly because I'm tending to shove a lot of Mirran Crusaders into my deck as of right now, and that card is just cripplingly good versus check pile. They have a hard trouble answering it. It gets to ignore their various threats or blockers like Baleful Strix, Gurmag Angler, and it also dodges a bunch of removal. So just having like Mirran Crusader in your deck is sort of like a hate bear for that matchup, so to speak.
I've seen you stream Mirran Crusader a couple of times before, and when you did, it was usually when you were trying out in place of what people tried with Brightling. So this card was like, the card was spoiled, and everybody was like, oh, this is gonna take D&T to the next level. But if you look at the results of the Pro Tour, and also on the feedback you get from pretty much, I want to say, all the experienced Death and Taxes pilots, they don't really like the card all that much. Like, it's a great card for what it does, but the impression you get is that what it does isn't really needed in Death and Taxes. Did you have the same feeling?
I love Brightling. I loved this card. It is so incredibly powerful. It has a high skill ceiling for use, and it rewards perfect or as close to perfect sequencing as you can get. It dominates some matchups, most notably the Miracles and Red Prison matchups, though it's very strong elsewhere, like against Eldrazi. However, against the black decks that are running around Legacy right now, it's significantly worse than something like Mirran Crusader or potentially even Serra Avenger. So a lot of people play a league and their Brightling gets walled by a Baleful Strix, and that's their data set for them, and they just go like, this is awful. Why would I ever play this card?
Are you still playing it right now? I think we can actually like put your deck list in the show note, but I'm not sure like what it looks like.
Okay, yeah. So my current deck list has 2 Mirran Crusaders and 1 Brightling as the sort of like generic beater cards in the main deck. I really want to have 2 Crusaders in the deck, maybe even 3, to just like make sure that Death Shadow Delver is a buy. Because the card is just so powerful there. It dodges literally all the removal that's commonly played there, unless they play like an Edict or 2 out the sideboard, and it walls both Gurmag and Death Shadow.
It's interesting you mentioned Death Shadow, because that was like the other big deck that came out of the Pro Tour that Team Channel Fireball showed up with. And I know, Bob, you have played some Death Shadow before in Legacy as well. Like, you played it in the last season of the LPL in the group stage. How do you feel about that deck right now, and how does it match up against Death and Taxes?
So I did play it, but the list I played was, I think, Grixis, and I was playing stuff like Monastery Swift Spear, so it was a pretty different deck from what people showed up at the PT with. But that being said, I have played the PT list a fair amount as well, and I have to say I'm not impressed by it. Like, Death Shadow, I'm just comparing it to Grixis Delver, because I think that's the closest deck. Death Shadow is weaker to opposing True Name Nemesis, Baleful Strix, Swords to Plowshares, Lightning Bolt, because, you know, when you're playing the Death Shadow deck, you want to go to pretty much exactly 9 life against Lightning Bolt, because if you're at 10 life, they can bolt the Death Shadow. So then you're at 9 life, well, okay, then the bolt still almost kills you after, like, you know, Bolt Snap Bolt or something. So I just think that deck is weaker to a lot more cards than regular Grixis Delver is. And in exchange, you get a little bit more powerful cards in Death Shadow, maybe Snuff Out, but now people aren't even playing Snuff Out because it doesn't kill Death Shadow. So, like, in exchange for some slightly more powerful cards, like, you are weaker to a lot more things. So I personally don't like the deck in general. And specifically against Death and Taxes, like, the people at the PT realized they needed 2 to 3 Dread of Knights to win that matchup. And so they did. Now, I personally think that you can't really show up at a GP with that many narrow sideboard cards. And honestly, even if you did, if the Death and Taxes pilot knows your plan and just, like, trims the white X ones, like, they can still beat that with certain configurations. So overall, I think the matchup's pretty bad for Blue-Black Shadow.
To support it with the data here, I am 9-1 versus Death Shadow.
Okay. I guess that's a statement.
It's not close. Like, even when they are playing a bunch of Dread of Knights, like, I've just figured out how to play around them, and, like, I've adjusted my sideboard plan for the matchup to be a little bit nonsensical. And like Bob suggested, like, I'm just cutting Thalias and Flicker Wisps, which normally are insane cards against Delver, but I'm just playing a slightly longer game against them, and I'm bringing in things like Gideon, Ally of Zendikar, leaving in my Revokers for Liliana the Last Hope, and when they play a Dread of Night, it almost does nothing. And if that's the case, and, like, that's your plan to beat D&T, it's not working.
Yeah, didn't the guy in the finals actually overcome something like double or triple Dread of Night in the final game because it ended up not being good enough, even though it's like still like one of the better cards you can play against Death and Taxes?
Yes, that was Alan Wu, and he masterfully beat triple Dread of Night.
Yeah, so I was just gonna add, like, so here's the thing, like, when you're playing Death Shadow against creature decks, especially go wide creature decks, like Death and Shadow isn't, Death and Taxes isn't necessarily a go wide creature deck, but it does play a huge amount of creatures, and you really need to put yourself in a spot when you go low that you need to answer every single creature, and like usually you can answer the first, 3 or 4 even, but then that fifth creature just beats you by itself, so it's definitely a tough spot.
It's interesting because both of you guys don't seem to like the deck too much. Yet I see guys like LSV going around, even after the Pro Tour, trying to recommend this to everyone and trying to sell it as the new big thing in Legacy. And I mean, I guess there's something to be said about like promoting his own content and stuff, but he seemed pretty convinced of the deck. And I wonder like whether we're going to see more of it or not.
To me, it just feels like it was the surprise factor and the fact that they, at the PT, I'm sure they had a great win rate against Southern Taxes because people didn't know their plan. But now people are going to have some time to play test against that deck with the deck that they're playing, and they're going to get some reps in and figure out, how to beat it. Added to that, I think Death Shadow is also very hard to play because you need to manage your life total. I found like you generally don't want to go too low. Like usually you might want to go to like around 13 or 15 or so. And then when you are ready to play your shadows, then you want to go low. But it's definitely like a hard thing to manage. And I think a lot of newer players who are just picking up the deck are going to struggle with it unless they've like, played the deck in Modern or something. So the deck is like both hard to play and weak to a lot of things that are happening in the format. Like it's also horrible against Chalice of the Void. So like I'm honestly like still trying to figure out how they did so well at the PT because every time I play the deck I'm like, okay, this is kind of like Grixis Delver, but just worse.
One big upside or one big improvement the deck saw was the banning of Deathrite Shaman in the way that like now you actually have to beat them in the combat step. My impression with elves has been like you can just drain them out with Deathrite Shaman while making a couple of jump blocks here and there, and then eventually they just die. But that's not happening anymore. I wonder, like Phil, from your perspective, you say you found ways to play around the deck and also Dread of Night, and you already mentioned a couple of sideboard adjustments that you have made. But in general, what's your approach? Because I think that can be hard to figure out how hard you want to press them in the early game because you're also helping them out with the life total. But I think you just ignore the shadow and like when it comes down, you have the Swords to Plowshares and they can probably never ever like put 2 in the battlefield anyways. What's your approach gameplay wise, not only sideboarding wise? Are you trying to beat them in the air eventually because they have to go low at some point and then Flicker Wisp can maybe do them in, or what's your take on that?
So in the game 1 scenarios, a lot of time the game is about mana development and management because that's when like the Thalias are still in your deck. So in game 1, like Vile tends to be one of your absolute best cards, as always, but especially so here. Because if you drop the early Vile and you can aggressively like waste Port and Thalia them, your superior cards just kind of take over the mid to late game if you make them stumble in the early game. About the only way I'll lose a game 1 to Death Shadow Delver is if they get sort of a quick double creature draw and they knock me off balance with like an early Thoughtseize or Daze, so I don't get to set myself up in any way. Post-board, go ahead. All right, so in the post-board games, I'm intending on playing a much slower game, and I almost don't go on the mana denial plan at all, and I just intend on trading resources with them for most of the game. Like one of my swords for one of their threats, one of my creatures for one of their removal spells. And because in the post-board games, like I've got all these recruiters, all these Gideons, and these higher impact cards and more answers to their threat, I just intend on dragging the game on for a long time and eventually getting them hellbent, and my top of the deck tends to be better than theirs.
So if we have somebody playing Death Shadow listening tonight, your recommendation would be to keep hands that are more aggressive, to put pressure on Death and Taxes and not trying to grind it out, even though I guess most Death Shadows players are aware that they can't really do that anyway, but that it's especially important to actually stick an early threat and protect it.
Yeah, I'd say that like the best Death Shadows hand against D&T, in my opinion, are the ones that can like thought seize to disrupt my early plan and then drop 2 threats. One threat usually isn't good enough because in the post sideboard games, I'll have 4 Swords to Plowshares, 2 Path to Exiles, maybe a Palace Jailer, probably 2 Council's Judgments. So that first threat is not enough to win the game. You need more.
If you wanted to improve your Death Shadow matchup, which is kind of funny because as we see in the Pro Tour, the players playing it were already aware of the problem by playing like 3 copies of Dread of Night. Is there anything else they could do? Or Bob, do you think it's not worth it to work on that matchup even more?
How Death Shadow can beat Death and Taxes? Yeah, I don't know. I'm struggling. Like, they've already tried the ham-fisted Dread of Night plan. Honestly, in blue-black, there aren't too many options, so I actually think it makes sense to splash a color. Either red for Lightning Bolt and a Braid, or green for Abrupt Decay and Golgari Charm out of the board. Those would be like potentially other avenues to attack the deck that might be more effective than just the blue-black list.
I agree, but I think that it might actually be better to splash for K command. I know it's more expensive, and the Death Shadow deck operates on like very, very low resources, generally speaking. But if you need to try to beat D&T, you might need to get greedy and like try to get those 2-for-1s with K commands instead of just the 1-for-1 with a Braid.
Well, here's the thing with K command is like against Stoneforge Mystic, it often is just like a 1-for-1. It's usually you're trading up in tempo typically because if they spend mana to equip or whatever. But sometimes it's still only a 1-for-1. I don't know. What do you think? Or is it just that it's a 2-for-1 enough of the time, and then against Stoneforge, yeah, it's maybe a 1-for-1, but in enough situations, it's insane.
Well, like preferably you don't use K command to answer Stoneforge Mystic, right? You try to use it to answer a piece of equipment and one other more relevant card than Stoneforge.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, but to me, like all of this sounds that the deck has already pushed its boundaries as far as it goes with Death and Taxes in mind, and adding even more cards to just overcome that. Because we're still talking about Legacy, right? Like, what percentage of the metagame will Death and Taxes eventually be? I mean, it's more approachable as a deck for new players because it doesn't have any reserved list cards, and basically I want to say it plays a creature plan, which is also something that people have an easier time getting into a format. But even then, I think targeting Death and Taxes even harder is probably gonna be like minus EV, I would think, but I could be wrong.
So I didn't realize that it had no reserve list cards, but now that I think about it, that's probably correct. But here's a follow-up question to that is, how come I don't see anybody playing all foil Death and Taxes? Because it's one of the few decks that you can play in all foil. But I feel like I've never, ever seen it before.
I did. Mark Koenig, Barra, used to play it when he still played and grinded a lot of tournaments.
Okay.
But I think eventually he sold it and it was a thing of beauty. When we went to the US in 2014, I had an all-foil elf stack, Mark had an all-foil Death and Taxes stack, Felix had an all-foil land stack, Philip had an all-altered Miracle stack, and Tomasz had like white bordered basics or something. I don't remember.
Nice.
But he still went X2 at the GP. So did you, Bob. Yeah, blast from the past. Another big deck to come out of the Pro Tour, which had kind of a resurgence, was Eldrazi. We saw 2 Eldrazi in the top 4. We also saw a lot of players pick it up and play it that you would usually not associate with a deck like that. I think even somebody like Kai Buddha came out playing Eldrazi, and a couple of the big teams decided, yeah, this is the place they want to be. Since we are talking mainly about Death and Taxes here, how do you feel about your matchup against Eldrazi, Phil?
This is one of those things where when you ask the D&T players and you ask the Eldrazi players this question, you'll get entirely different responses. No one really tends to agree on this. So I think like the best objective way to put it is that D&T cannot beat Eldrazi's best starts. Like when they just go like Mimic into Thought-Knot Seer into Smasher, that's just way too much pressure 90% of the time.
I guess technically the best start kills you on the second turn, right? But yeah, that's
sans those though, Eldrazi also can't beat D&T's best starts, where they're just like on the play and they lead on Vile and then waste and ports you into Oblivion. So there's a lot of non-games on both sides, but in sort of like we both have a mediocre draw games, I feel like D&T ends up being favored just due to the equipment package and the Flicker Wisp recruiter chain as the games go on. But it's even-ish as a whole But a lot of the pros in testing their Eldrazi matchups versus D&T, they did not like what they saw.
Oh, they didn't? Because my impression on Twitter has been that a couple of the pros mentioned that Eldrazi, like one of the reasons to play it was that it was good against, or supposed to be good against Death and Taxes. And to me, like a couple months ago, that was before the ban, but I guess that didn't affect that matchup too much. My impression had always been that Death and Taxes was definitely the side you wanted to be on, like except for these corner case scenarios that we mentioned. But in general, I would rather be on that side, especially with a card like Mirroring Crusader. Even though it's like not great, it still trades for Thought-Knot Seer, and like it has a lot of potential. Like Mother of Runes isn't great, doesn't really do much, so you can't force through your equipment except for in the air, which is also like kind of a big thing. But overall, like unless Eldrazi actually has a couple of like dedicated sideboard cards, I think that Death and Taxes should be clearly favored. And I might get some hate for this comment because I actually only like my information on that matchup just comes from watching it a lot. But so what are the cards out of Eldrazi that can actually swing it around like for them?
Okay, so before I do that, just to kind of like support what I'm saying with data, right now I'm 2-2 against regular Eldrazi in the post banning world. So as far as critical cards go, the Eldrazi deck is not going to beat you with like Mimics and Matter Reshapers. It's the curve toppers that are the problems, like the Thought-Knot Seer, Reality Smasher, Oblivion Sower if they're playing that, and especially Walking Ballista. Just like drawing one of those in the mid to end game and being able to deploy it for, 3 or something like that is just devastating.
Do you keep in Revokers in that matchup?
Yes.
You do for Walking Ballista?
Yes. Oh, yes. That card is so terrifying. And additionally, the Eldrazi decks usually have Jitte in the 75, often in the main deck. And that's a card that if they have it, like, and put that on a Trampler, we're done. That's so difficult to beat.
But I would think you still keep your own Jitte, right? Because it still can clean up a board of like a couple of Mimics.
Yeah, and if you get like a Jitte in the air or like a Jitte on a Mirror Crusader or something like that, it's still extremely powerful.
What's your take, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is that Death and Taxes late game is so much better due to the Stoneforge Mystic package. Basically, you assemble, any creature plus a sword or plus a Batter Skull, and it pretty much beats Eldrazi. So I think the mid to late game definitely favors Death and Taxes, and also Eldrazi plays so little removal that it's kind of stuck trying to win that early game with a fast start. I will say that I agree with Phil. Walking Ballista is one of the key cards in the matchup, as well as potentially Endbringer if you play it. And so to me, for sure you want to be playing your Vokers on the D&T side, because they're not that great game one. They probably only hit 2 Jittes, but post board they get a lot better. Actually people are playing Ballista main too. Like I know people who are testing like 4 Ballista in Eldrazi because it's so good against a lot of the fair strategies. And to me, that's interesting. It makes sense. That being said, Ballista is far less powerful in the Eldrazi Mimic build of Eldrazi because they don't play Cloud Posts. And so they have Eye of Ugin, which pretty much doesn't tap for Ballista unless you have Urborg. And then their Eldrazi temples are also only tap for 1 mana instead of 2. So like to me, like it makes sense that they want that effect because it's good against Baleful Strix, it's good against Delver. But it's not a particularly overpowering card because you're not able to cheat mana with it unless you play Cloud Post as well.
Yeah. So, Eldrazi, do you think it was justified that so many people actually jumped on that train? Because I was listening to the Leaving a Legacy podcast the other day when they were discussing the Pro Tour results, and they were kind of surprised that at the Pro Tour so many people opted to play Eldrazi, but also Black-Red Reanimator. I think they even mentioned Jarvis, who wrote a really great post on Reddit about his testing process and how he arrived at Black-Red Reanimator. And basically what they were saying is that they always had the impression that, like, I guess, quote-unquote, good players would always like gravitate towards more controller strategies and not play these higher variant strategies like Eldrazi or general Chalice decks or Black-Red Reanimator. And I think I heavily disagree with that, for the reason being that like the really good players, they don't really care about these things as long as they believe to have like a better shot at winning the tournament by going down that way. Like, if you don't have your ego in the game and you don't care about how you win as long as your win percentage is higher playing a Chalice deck than playing, say, Miracles, I think you're actually the better player if you can overcome that. So that's just something I wanted to mention. But in general, how do you feel about Eldrazi?
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, Julian. Like the true pros don't care at all about, if a deck is easy or hard. They'll just try to maximize their win percentage. Whereas, grinders at the PTQ level might be more focused on playing, oh, I'm going to play a blue deck, it's Legacy. That being said, you did still see that phenomenon where Grixis Control was a deck in the format, but it showed up as the most played deck at the PT. So a lot of people maybe still had that mentality, oh, I like to play fair cards, and Grixis Control is okay at answering everything. So I think a lot of people still did have that mentality, but then again, it's the PT. People just care about winning, and if they decide that Eldrazi is their best path to victory, they're going to play it. The other key thing too, and this is a question that a lot of people ask me, is oh, hey Bob, what should I play in Legacy? I haven't been winning that much. How do I bring my win rate up? And to me, my answer is always okay, well that's great, but what do you care about? Do you care about winning in the short term or in the longer term? Because to me, how I answer that question depends on how much they care about winning now versus winning in the long run. Because if they want to win now, I think decks like Eldrazi, Reanimator, Show and Tell are better choices. And that's not to say that there's no skill playing these decks at all. There definitely is a lot of skill. There's a reason that Jonathan Angelescu was the only Sneak and Show player to finish, well with the deck. It's because he's been playing the deck forever. And I think, there's a reason that Eric Landon is the trophy leader on Magic Online by such a huge margin, and other people's win percentage with the deck is only okay. There still is skill in those decks, but it's easier to pick those decks up than, say, a deck like Death and Taxes or Delver. Yeah, so what's your take, Phil?
Right after the banning, I thought Eldrazi was going to be one of the best decks, and though I didn't stream with it very much, I actually played something like 10 leagues with Eldrazi or something like that. I thought the deck was incredibly well positioned, and I'm a big fan of Chalice of the Void personally. It just hands you so many free wins. To just kind of plug a friend, Lewis CBR has been crushing it with Eldrazi online. I think he slipped a little bit in the trophy leader race, but he's still doing fantastically with that card. And I think that the shell is very powerful right now.
So is it a deck that you think belongs to the very, very upper echelons of Legacy right now? So basically my question is, how do you view Legacy right now when it comes to the very best decks? What are the decks you should be looking to beat when you want to take down your next medium or large size tournament?
I'd say D&T is probably the deck with the bullseye painted on its back right now.
Oh, is it really?
I would imagine so. In my mind, and based on conversations I've had with a lot of people, if you want to be playing a deck, you need to have a game plan to beat D&T right now. And so I think D&T is one of the best decks. I think Sneak and Show is probably pretty good because its D&T matchup is good. And that's a big reversal from a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those Sneak and Show players finally figured out how to beat Death and Taxes, and it's basically by playing Omniscience and Cunning Wish, basically becoming more like Omnitel, which was, a pretty bad matchup for Death and Taxes.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how that used to be one of the best matchups for Death and Taxes, and these days you have to play cards like War Priest of Thune and stuff to even just stand a chance.
Yeah, it's pretty shameful what I've done to try to beat that deck.
I mean, I've seen that card before, even before you shipped me that list, but it always makes me giggle because it's such a dedicated hate card for really just a single matchup. I guess, to its credit, it also takes down Dread of Night.
Yeah.
Is it even a 2/2?
Yeah, so War Priest of Thune is
you can flicker Wisp it later on.
And you can flicker Wisp it later for massive value. I'm currently playing with Leon and Relic Order over it, but it's one of those cards that I'm still testing it. I was playing it today in 5-color humans, for example.
Are there any other interesting variations of Death and Taxes we could focus on? Because I recently read an interview that you had with Alan Wu, the guy who did actually win. Yeah, they won the Pro Tour, right? So much for doing my research. No. And he had a couple of interesting takes on Death and Taxes that you said you could explore even further, on your stream and in articles. So I was wondering whether you could share those with us.
Yeah, so one of the things he said was that he suspected that, the best version of D&T hasn't been optimized yet, and that, the best version of D&T may take some cards from, the modern playbook and instead go up to a much larger land count and just focus more on utility lands.
Even larger?
Even larger.
Death and Taxes already plays, you play 20 22 or 23 lands, I would think.
So stock for D&T is 23 lands. A lot of people are playing with 24. He suggests that something like 26 or 27 lands might be optimal.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah. So here's the rationale. He thinks that filling the deck with like Horizon Canopies and Mishra's Factories might let you more consistently cast your powerful cards and help you hedge against flooding as the game goes on.
Interesting. Playing more lands to hedge against flooding. I mean, I can see the idea because you can cycle your canopies later on. It still makes it so that the cards you draw are also like less likely to be impactful. By the way, shout out to Bob Stock.
Tully, come over here. Tully!
You can be a co-host on the show. Mishra's Factory is something we've actually seen out of Death and Taxes' grandfather, Thomas Ingevoldsen, before. I remember the Danes actually running that technology, but I think, if I understand correctly, Alan wants to run like multiple Mishra's Factories. Is that correct?
Yeah, so he wants to do something like run 4 Horizon Canopies, 4 Ports, 4 Wastes, and then maybe like 2 or 3 Factories, and really push hard the land-based value.
So if I ask you right now, are you gonna try that out on stream? Because if you do, I will link it in the show notes, because I'm sure everybody listening right now will want to see that.
I'm absolutely going to try that out, but how soon I will do that is another question. Even if that's really good, to be frank, I don't think I have time in the next 12 days or whatever to like test and optimize a list of that nature. That's something that after the GP, that's when I would probably start exploring something like that, just because we're getting a little close to crunch time as far as testing goes.
I'm just super interested in that, because I'm also wondering which matchups in general are you looking to improve by that, and where are you conceding points by basically you have to cut something, right? Unless you go like 67 cards or something.
The Julian special.
Let's not talk about that. I'm actually playing 60 right now, by the way. I haven't found the best 61st card yet.
It's tricky.
So yeah, what are you cutting in a list like that?
So one of the problems with like going up to that many lands is your creature count starts to become very low. And one of the not the problems, but one of the things you need to be aware of with D&T is that you have more creatures in your deck for game 1 than you do for games 2 and 3 most of the time, because you're bringing in cards like Path to Exile, Council's Judgment, Rest in Peace, Surgical Extraction, stuff of that nature. So if your game 1 creature count is already lower than what you theoretically want, and then in post-sideboard games you're also trimming more creatures, I'm really worried about the deck just becoming too threat light. But I understand why you would want to play more lands, because if you play more lands, you can more reasonably do things like recruiter chains more consistently. And if you're playing something like Palace Jailer, you can consistently cast that on turn 4 or something like that.
I mean, I can see the idea behind it. What's threatening to me is you also play 4 Wiles. So at that point, like, more than half of your deck is basically mana. I mean, yes, you got 4 canopies that draw cards, but that's really in a format like Legacy, where sometimes flooding out can be your death nail, pretty much. Like, that's basically why I want to see it, because to me it sounds actually absolutely crazy, but this is coming out of the guy who won the Pro Tour playing Death and Taxes, and so there's probably some value to trying that. I take it Alan hasn't really tried it himself yet, or has he?
I think he did very limited testing, but he was not comfortable enough with the idea to like run a deck list that featured it.
And by that he probably means his teammates gave him shit for it, and he was like, okay, I'm gonna play the standard list. You know what that sounds like to me? That actually sounds a lot like the deck would be going down the path of 4-color Loam, which is a deck that actually runs something like 26 lands, and I could be wrong. I think it's a little less.
The stock lists are on 27, including Dryad Arbor now. It was 26 for a long time.
Okay, including 4 Mox Diamonds, which in a way I would kind of want to put in the same level as Ethervile with regards to having actual business cards in your deck. Bob, you actually played that deck in the group stage of the Legacy Premier League. That was kind of like a surprise to me. How did he actually arrive at that? And like, what do you think about that take that Phil just mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, to me that's interesting. Like, I'm sure Alan must have observed something that he was like, oh wow, I'm losing this game because I'm not able to make this land drop and I have all these powerful cards in my hand. So he must have observed that more often than he observed, like, oh, I just drew too many lands. The other thing about Death and Taxes is it's very mana intensive. It can always use its extra mana to port the opponent, or even like something like Batter Skull is also extremely mana intensive, which is why at a certain point in the game, like the D&T player like stops Wastelanding Delver because they're trying to like return Batter Skulls and things like that. So I think it's a very mana intensive deck, and it could be the right way to go. That being said, like, you know, all of the reservations you guys all listed, I have them too. So I'd be curious to see if there was something like that that could work. Did you have a question on Four Color Loam too, or like why I played the deck?
Yeah.
So it was kind of like I looked at the other people playing in LPL, and I was kind of looking for a deck that was good against Death and Taxes, good against Elves, while still being reasonable against a deck like the Epic Storm and lands, because I thought Jarvis might play lands. So it was kind of like in that intersection of decks that I thought like was weird, and also just happened to be favored against the matchups I was looking at, or at least I could like build the sideboard in 75 to be favored in those specific matchups. So that's why I decided to play it. I decided not to play it in the single deck stage because that's kind of more like the playoffs, and I wanted to play something that I knew better. And I had been doing well with Grixis Delver, so I decided to just play what I knew. That being said, I still think Four Color Loam is a strong deck. So I don't know. It's weird to me because it doesn't do any of the like fundamentally powerful things in Legacy. Like, for example, I think Legacy is about turn one like Dark Ritual kill you, or like Delver, or turn one like Vial is also an insanely powerful play. Turn one Vial is way more GPs than turn one Chalice, and has top aided more GPs as well. So I think if people talk about broken one mana plays or turn one plays, like I think turn one Vial should be talked about as much as like turn one Chalice, I think. But yeah, that's just an aside. So like so the Four Color Loam deck can get a turn one Chalice, but it requires a few more cards to do, and it's a lot more rare. And in general, it's just playing like these generic good cards like Liliana of the Veil, Knight of the Reliquary, Punishing Fire, and like those cards are really good. But basically it's going to be like, hey, are these cards good in the matchup? And you're also at the mercy of what you draw. So I don't know. I think that deck definitely has a place in the metagame.
Yeah, I like it a lot. I definitely like it. I generally like these green mid-range strategies, which I guess also shows in the way I play. People have told me a couple of times, like I don't really like treat it as a combo deck. I just really like get the incremental advantage. What I find interesting is that Phil mentioned playing more lands to also like get better mana in a way. To me, there's like a natural progression of mid-range decks, or like Stoneforge Mystic based mid-range decks. I guess you can't say Stoneforge Mystic, but you get the idea. And to me, that's like there's Death and Taxes, and then if you want to go a little faster, you play Maverick, and if you want to go like dedicate to that strategy even more, you play Four Color Loam. And I already mentioned this to you guys, and not everyone agreed with me, but I strongly believe that Green White Maverick is not only a good deck, but actually one of the very best decks in the format right now, or at least I want to call it the by far most underrated deck in the format. And this goes basically with the idea that Death and Taxes is not only a great deck in the format right now, and Maverick is kind of like Death and Taxes, but better mana-wise. And it's unfortunate that we couldn't have Marius Hausmann in the cast, because he wanted to talk about that, and I've been working with him on Green White Maverick for quite a while now, and he also did really well with it at MKM Prague. I think the only 2 times he lost were to Miracles. One time he actually kind of threw it away, I have to say. The other time he ran into a very unlucky string of cards, which probably only comes up in like 2 out of 100 games or something. But my idea right now, and that also goes back to the idea of Alan Wu, that Death and Taxes could do better if it had like better mana. Maverick has that better mana. Maverick has a lot more turn 1 plays that give it better mana. You've got like 4 Noble Hyrax, 4 Queen Sun Sonnets, and 1 Birds of Paradise, at least in what I want to call the stock list that Marius is like promoting right now. And that way you actually get to do these a little bit more over the top plays. And on top of that, you have Gaia's Cradle. And most people, including Marius, didn't believe that Gaia's Cradle is really good in the deck. But I told him, you really have to try it, because I've seen what Gaia's Cradle does in Death and Taxes, and yeah, I guess Death and Taxes as well, but now it's turning into Maverick. And that card is transformational, and you even have like 4 tutors for it in the form of Knight of the Reliquary. And you guys can see the deck list. I've sent it to you, and you guys listening, you can see it in the show notes below. I strongly believe that this deck is really, really good. I think it has better opening hands than Death and Taxes. It has more relevant turn one plays. It has better consistency mana-wise. And it has better game against blue, even though I still want to say it has better game against blue because of Choke and Sylvan Library, even though I can't ignore that Etherwile is probably one of the very best decks, very best cards you can play against those blue controlish decks. But to me, that has been my impression. I've played that deck a lot before playing Elves, and we kind of reverted back to that old meta game in a way, and it certainly feels like when playing the deck. I would strongly recommend it to anyone looking to play Death and Taxes, but maybe with a little bit of a twist, like being a little bit more explosive, having, I would even say, a little bit more tricks up your sleeve in the form of Script Ranger, which is the one card that actually makes or breaks your game sometimes. I am considering even playing a second Script Ranger. But yeah, I mean, we talked about that. You guys didn't really believe me. I actually want to go forward and make a couple of Maverick streams in the near future. And I could be wrong and could turn out that it's really bad. But from everything I've seen from Marius and also from playing the deck myself, I'm really impressed with it. Also with the combo matchup. I think that, especially in the first game, but also post-board most of the time, Maverick actually has a better combo matchup. Speaking of something like Storm combo, not so much against the random sneak show decks. I think those, while not good against Death and Taxes, for Death and Taxes, are even worse for Maverick. But other than that, especially against Storm, I'd much rather be on the Maverick side of things. But yeah, now shoot me down, do whatever you want. But I wanted to get this out there that I really, really strongly believe that this deck is really good. I actually know Jarvis tested it out for the Pro Tour as well.
I think you alluded to it, but my answer to you is 2 words: Ether Vial. It's just more powerful than.
That's the one thing that's making me doubt my opinion as well.
Yeah, so the mana dorks are that so you play in Maverick, so it's 4 green sun, 1 noble, or 1 birds, 4 noble. It does let you have that consistent acceleration, which is key in a matchup like Delver. But I do think the mana dorks are more liabilities in certain matchups, like when games go long, like against Miracles and Grixis Control. And even against Delver, some of the time you can be okay, I'll ignore the mana, I'll go for the face, or I'll go for the relevant creatures instead. So I think it's the fundamental question is how powerful are these mana dorks? And I think they're just not quite as powerful as Ether Vial, even if they give a little bit more added consistency. Now, I do see some matchups where Maverick is clearly better than Death and Taxes. I think in the mirror they might be slightly ahead, but against something like Eldrazi, having Knight of the Reliquary in your deck puts you, miles ahead. And against a deck like Lands as well, having Knight is really key. So I think there are definitely matchups where I'd rather be playing Maverick over Death and Taxes, but I think against blue decks, Ether Vial is a much harder to answer card and much more powerful as well.
Phil, what's your take? I guess you like Death and Taxes a lot, but just let us know.
So I spent the last 2 streams I've done actually playing with an Orcish Lumberjack Loam deck, of all things. And
that's actually a big trend in Legacy right now.
It's Solnox's fault. He keeps 5-0ing with this Orcish Lumberjack deck, and it's a lot of fun. So what I saw from that is that Recurring Wasteland is insane right now, and Knight of the Reliquary is a very good threat. It can get bigger than things like Gurmag Anglers relatively quickly, and as well for the random people who are still playing Tarmogoyfs, it outclasses those. And I won so many games just by taking a turn or 2 off to just wasteland my opponent into oblivion. So I think the green mana denial decks like Agrolome, or whatever you want to call it, and Maverick are certainly well-positioned decks. And the question you're going to need to ask yourself, if you want to play one of those, is what I'm going to be doing better than what I can gain by playing D&T? And that's where it becomes a little bit trickier, and you would need to really sit down and do play testing of both, compare some data. I do really like Marius's list, although I'd be pretty tempted to slam a Shalai Voice of Plenty in there somewhere.
Yeah, I can see. It's basically the same. The problem about Shalai is she's not green. But it's otherwise basically the same slot as Sigarda, because we don't really care all that much about what Sigarda actually does, but what she is. And she's a 5/5, or is she 5/4? Man, I haven't played that deck like to that extent. Yeah, she's 5/5. Okay. I haven't played the deck in that configuration a lot lately. But she is a big, fat, green girl, and that's what we want. A flyer, a big fat green flyer, and that's why she's in the deck. You can replace her for other cards, but like having evasion and being Green Sun Sunny Devil, that's the entire idea behind her. Otherwise, I would totally agree that Shalai would certainly have a spot in that, especially in like once you have cards like Cradle and stuff going on.
Yeah, that's the dream. Let me tell you, I've played a little bit of Maverick in recent memory, and like Shalai plus Cradle just felt disgusting. Even worse if it's backed up by Mom.
Yeah. It's interesting that Bob mentioned that it's all about Etherwile versus the Mana Dogs, because to me, what it actually comes down to is having the power of Etherwile versus having the power of Night. Because I think Night is the best it's been in something like 5 or 6 years in Legacy right now, and it devastates mana bases. I think that in most of the games, Maverick actually has the slightly better mana denial even, because it's less dependent on having that, like, your mana denial Death and Taxes is good, but it's only really good when you also have Wild going on. Otherwise, it's okay-ish. Whereas in Maverick, because it has so many more turn 1 accelerators, you can more quickly get to a spot where you can like mana deny your opponent and actually get some value out of that tempo-wise. And that's why I really, really feel like Knight is the one card you should be looking to abuse here. And if you want to compare that, the power level of that card, it's against the power level of Wild. And that's, I think, the big comparison you have to make and pick your side on that.
So
spectrum.
I can agree with that. So taking a look from that perspective then, like where do you think it's better or worse compared to a deck like Four Color Loam? So my take on Maverick and Death and Taxes. Well, okay, so here's a little prelude to that. My take on the overall metagame is I agree Death and Taxes is one of the best decks. I think Miracles is also one of the best decks that nobody's really talking about, but it absolutely destroyed MKM Prague. It, fundamentally is playing a broken card in Terminus and, has enough of a supporting cast like around it. And I've, at one of the MTGO challenges too, there were like maybe 3 in the top 8 the week before the PT. So, and it didn't have a great showing at the PT itself, but I still think it's a deck that shouldn't be underestimated. And in my metagame tracking, it's actually the number 1 deck from the MTGO challenges, followed by Death and Taxes. So I think Miracles is an excellent deck, and I actually do like Miracles positioning against both Maverick and Death and Taxes, with the Death and Taxes side being slightly harder because they have Ether Vial. So that was kind of an aside, is I think Miracles is really good right now. But I guess going back to what I was saying about Maverick was, I haven't played too much Maverick, but I have played 4 Color Loam. And to me, 4 Color Loam, you have Chalice, you have some bigger planeswalkers that are hard for Miracles to deal with at least. So it definitely seems better against Miracles. Where does it seem like 4 Color Loam seem worse than Maverick, that you would want to play Maverick over 4 Color Loam?
I totally agree that 4 Color Loam is much, much better against Miracles. I think when it comes to Miracles, I'd also rather be on the Death and Taxes side than on the Maverick side, because Miracles is the one matchup we have to work for the most to get it to like a reasonable position. The first game is really bad against Miracles. In the second game and third game, hopefully, it gets a lot better, but that's still, like, you're still fighting an uphill battle, and in the overall context of the matchup, that's not where you want to be. So that's the one big downside of the Maverick, I feel, right now. Compared to 4 Color Loam, I think that for 4 Color Loam to be better than Maverick, it needs Mox Diamond in the opening hand. And that's really the make it or break it card. That's always the way I viewed 4 Color Loam. Not only like from the Elves perspective, but that's also the same basic idea. Like, I think if they have the Mox Diamond on the first turn, you are quite far behind with Elves. Whereas if they don't, I think you're at least even. And like, the matchups depend a lot on whether you get that Mox. And like we all know, that's like there's the 40% chance to have it like in your opening 7, and you're not even keeping all of those. And that's basically the idea. I can only speak for Marius here as well. Marius also kind of likes 4 Color Loam, but he also has the same problem that I have with it. That's like, it hinges so much on that first turn Mox Diamond, which is also like a kind of a similar concept, not as pronounced in Death and Taxes, that really wants to turn 1 Etherwile. So he's more gravitating towards deck that has like less variance in the opening hands, which also goes back to having like more accelerators early on to abuse Knight even better afterwards. But compared to 4-color Loam, if I could have Mox Diamond more consistently in 4-color Loam, I would only play 4-color Loam the entire time. And those hands are much better than the average Maverick hands, for sure. But you can't always have that unless they print additional copies of that card, which would be like kind of weird.
It's on the reserve list.
Oh yeah. So I guess they can always print like a better one. But yeah, I also want to agree that Miracles is probably one of the most underplayed decks, at least at Pro Tour. In general, probably not even. But on the Pro Tour, it certainly felt absolutely underplayed. And I was listening to Gerry T's podcast the other day, and they also said they were so surprised how few people actually played Miracles at the Pro Tour. Because when they built their deck, they had like Miracles in their mind, and it was like this huge target printed on it. But then Miracles didn't really show up, so where is it?
I'm 5-4 versus Miracles in the post-banning world, but the matchup feels pretty difficult. The modern Miracles deck is way better against D&T than the Sensei's Divining Top version ever was, in my opinion, because...
And by modern, you mean the current
yes.
day version of
Sorry,
Miracles?
poor word choice on my end. All right. So the Neo Miracles doesn't have top in it, and Revoker used to be an awesome early play against Miracles. Like, they'd keep their hand on the strength of top, go, Revoker, top. And you got like a lot of free ones that way. And now you get way fewer free wins versus Miracles, and you kind of have to like grind them all out. And you don't always have cards that can just interact with their cantrips. And the games where like you don't have a Thalia to like get rid of their mana, or like a Spirit of the Labyrinth to stop them from cantripping, a lot of times they're just going to like Terminus you once or twice and then lock the game up with Jace.
Do you also agree that you'd rather play Death and Taxes against Miracles? Because to me, the idea is you have this huge trump card that's even better in the first game in Vile. And talking to Miracles players, they're like, well, if they resolve the turn 1 Vile, I feel like I'm miles behind. And having this kind of opportunity to actually get there, to me, that's just... I want to say, I've got this idea about Magic that I want to get as many free wins, quote-unquote, as I can. And even though like turn 1 Vile isn't a free win, it certainly contributes to making the matchup a lot easier.
So I'm going to write an article about this sometime, because like it keeps coming up. But I have what I call the critical card theory. And I believe that some decks have a card that it is so powerful in your deck that when you have it in your opener and it resolves, your win percentage shoots up by an absurd amount. You know, let's say at least 10%. And I feel like for D&T, that card is Ether Vial. For Loam, that card is Mox Diamond. You know, for a Reanimator deck, it might be something like Entomb. For your Chalice decks, it might be Chalice. And I feel like the games...
For Elves, it's certainly Cradle.
Yeah. For the games where like you do and don't have that card, you're playing entirely different sorts of Magic. And in the Miracles matchup, like turn 1 Vial is such a pronounced difference to your win percentage that sometimes it's even worth mulliganing an acceptable hand to see if you can find a Vial hand.
Oh, I've actually heard a couple of really good players say that they believe that if Death and Taxes could guarantee to always have Vial in the opening hand, it would far and away be the best deck in Legacy, which kind of wowed me, because that's quite the statement. I'm not sure if I can agree with it, but because it's like a very, very big statement, and of course it's like super hypothetical, we can't really know, but that has led me to believe that maybe, even though I think the card is great, I'm still underrating Vial a little bit. I don't know.
It's amazing the hands that you can keep that have Ether Vial in it. Like, you can keep a 1-land Ether Vial hand with a fistful of 3-drops in many, many cases. And the power of Aether Vial in the late game, just allowing you to just like catch up on all of the mana that you've missed, is crazy.
It kind of goes along with what you were saying earlier, Phil, about like if Legacy is slowed down, then your Vials are taking up to 3, and that's just so powerful against all the fair decks. So we've passed the 1 hour mark. We're probably going to wrap it up soon, but before we do that, actually, I do want to talk about this one topic, which I think is going to be on the front of a lot of people's minds, is, how to attack Death and Taxes. So we covered a little bit about Dread of Night, Kolaghan's Command. I think those cards are excellent. I think something like Null Rod is also, maybe should see more play right now, given how good it is against Death and Taxes, shutting down their Vials and Stoneforge Mystics.
It's funny you mentioned that card. I actually had it in my sideboard for LPL this week, like 1 or 2 copies, and like just ended up cutting it on short notice. So it's kind of funny that 2 people think about the same card, and probably even more. So we might see more of that card in the future.
Yeah, so what do you think, Phil? Like, obviously, we're kind of speaking generally, but like, what sideboard cards are you most scared of facing?
So I'd say static cards that can sit on the board and generate long-term value against my deck are the scariest cards to play against. So for example, something like Bitter Blossom. When that unexpectedly hits the battlefield out of the sideboard, D&T gets scared because it's a ton of bodies. It can trade with my creatures. It, is essentially a win condition on its own. I think cards like that can sit on the table and do me a lot of harm are the most scary things. So things like Null Rod, we've already said what there is to say about Dread of Night, but things like that as well. Or something like, Is It Staticaster, where it can just keep pinging and pinging and pinging and pinging. I don't think the one-shot sideboard cards are good enough. So, like, your things like an Abrade, for example, it's not really a great card against D&T. It's just fine. So I would be looking for heavy-hitting, probably artifacts or enchantments if you really want to get D&T good.
What enchantments?
Sorry, Bitter Blossom was the one that I had in mind.
Okay, and I guess like only a couple decks can play it, but like something like Humility or whatever.
Yeah, every once in a while, like I'll come across a Miracles deck that's playing the like Rip, Helm, Humility type of stuff, and those I despair a lot when I have to play against some of those cards. Like Energy Field, another one.
Yeah, I guess those enchantments and artifacts, they are especially effective when coming out of decks that you usually wouldn't bring in your artifact or enchantment removal. So they get to have like pretty close to a free win if they get to stick those in the second game. And then the third game, you can bring in your stuff. I guess you're running counter judgment, so that's like a catch-all answer, but you're not always bringing those in as well.
Well, I think Flicker Wisps just happens to be a great catch-all against almost everything, outside of Humility pretty much. It's a good catch-all to stuff like Ensnaring Bridge and like Chalice of the Void. That's why people side out their chalices against Death and Taxes,
So another one of the enchantments that I'm scared of, but like thankfully no one ever plays, is Pernicious Deed. That's like sometimes literally a 10-for-1 against D&T. Mm-hmm. That card's rough.
Don't jinx it. I don't want to see that card. So I guess that's stuff for a future episode, but maybe is there some kind of Pernicious Deed control deck out there? I want to see it. And please don't tell me it's Nick Fit, okay? Guys, okay, we're going to wrap it up for today. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. Thanks for coming on, Phil and Bob. If you guys want to hear more about this, I was thinking maybe you could leave us a review on iTunes or pretty much there, because I think we don't even have one yet, so that would be like super, super cool if you could do that. Next week on Wednesday, we have the losers round 2 of the Legacy Premier League coming up. We got Bob Huang on Grixis Delver taking on Andrea Mangucci's Blue-Red Omnitel, Caleb Durwell's Man of Steel or Steel Stompy going up against Vincent Chandler's Death and Taxes. Travis Hugh on Grixis Delver is trying to overcome my elves. And then, for probably the match of the week, and a match that a lot of people would have likely considered to be the finals of the entire league, we have Noah Walker and former world champion Brian Brown-Dune playing the Grixis Control Mirror. I'm really looking forward to that one, even though I'm not a big fan of the deck. I'm certainly a fan of both players, and I really can't wait for that. So definitely tune in, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 11 p.m. Central European Summer Time. See you there. Other than that, if you want to leave us feedback, there's iTunes, there's Twitch, there's Twitter, or just check out It's Julian, and see you again next time. Bye-bye.